Hello, my name is Sheldon Scott, and I'm the Global Director of Culture at Eaton. And we are very honored to be participating in programming around the Commitment March, which marks the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington on August the 28th of 2020. And it's amazing to be a part of a critical conversation, a dialogue that, was spiked by the death of George Floyd and spiked by the murder of George Floyd, and led by the National Action Network and Martin Luther King III. So as a part of the programming, we put together some conversations about race that not only focus on social justice and police violence, but also conversations around real estate, conversations around the construct of family, and doing as much as we can to kind of delve in and pull back all of the racist infrastructure that impacts the Black American identity. And one of those things that we all realize that is inseparable in the United States is the conversation of race and real estate. I think since the concept of real estate and race were invented, those things have been inseparable. Going back as far as like when we first started building houses and land, and the murder of the indigenous people who were here before the colonizers came, and all the way up to now, and talking about some of the conversations that are part of the current election cycle, where we're starting to see a lot of the same fear tactics that have been used time and time again when it comes to the matter of race, real estate, and wealth. And a good friend of mine, who I've known for several years, has been doing tremendous work in that. And I'm just so excited to finally have the exhibition here, which we're going to talk about a lot more later. And more excited to have my friend April D. Simone from Designing the Weed to help us talk about some of the work that she's been doing and help us to put in context some of the conversations about race and real estate. So thank you for joining me, April. And I would love to just start off with you sharing with us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing.
Absolutely, and before I start, I just really want to commend the space of the Eaton Workshop in creating the safe space to have these types of conversations and bring the necessary and critical dialogue to the issues around race, place, and class in this country, and make it a statement to say that as a business, you have pledged an allegiance to really accentuating that there is a value of this topic, of these discussions, and necessary for us in order to move forward. So I really commend you, and thank you so much for opening the doors of Eaton for the Young Design Redlining exhibition, and again, to delve into things like hierarchy of human value.
No, my pleasure. I think Catherine's vision for this place is super critical and incredibly timely, probably more than she actually realizes, and I think it's really an honor for us to be able to create space for organizations and conversations like yours.
Wonderful, perfect. Well, again, I'm delighted to be here and coming in from the Bronx and into, a sort of a time warp and travel, and looking at these posters of the August 28, 1963 March on Washington, and how in 2020, we're putting our fists in the air and demanding sort of the same acknowledgement and recognition of our humanity. This isn't about just race and class and place. It's taking a bird's eye view of the assault that is taking place generation after generation on our humanity. And a nation that purports ideologies and principles of democracy, there'll be no democracy if we can't harness that humanity. So it's really timely conversations, but timely conversations that I think have been accentuated in every generation since the votes landed on this continent.
Yeah, I think the point that you just made about almost how this conversation is generational, and like I said, I think we're honoring the 50th anniversary, and we think about, you know, how the context of that conversation has changed or not changed. And, you know, I think definitely learning from past human rights and civil rights movement, you know, what we have learned, what we've garnered, and how we've now armed ourselves in different ways in this fight for justice that you mentioned has been since the boats landed. I think it's always been that way. So when it comes to the idea of like the fight and the need to take place in this country, you know, I think one thing that is, you know, and incredibly true of the United States is how, you know, it is the highest form of achievement in this country is capitalistic. You know, it's like the greatest ambitions and aspirations of the country about how much wealth you can actually build and attain. And to lay that conversation over the history, the systematic history of like preventing Black people, people of color, from actually accessing wealth through the concept of real estate is, you know, it's just like a conversation I feel like we just don't have enough of. You know, I had the occasion to speak to someone from another country, and they asked a very honest question about, you know, how can immigrants from Asia and other places come to the United States and be so successful, but then Black Americans still seem to have a hard time. And you know, and I know that was in the context of wealth. You know that's what it, you know, you meant, because like, you know, you couldn't mean that culturally. But you know, what I asked them is if they had ever heard of the concept of redlining, and they had not. And you know, I just explained to them, it's like, you know, just like what I said just now, you know, the ability to access wealth in this country is no more direct pathway to wealth than real estate. And you know, and how do you expect a population to survive if they're denied that same opportunity? And it's like, you know, and it doesn't have to be the context of like being in white neighborhoods. You know, you can be in a Black neighborhood, you can be sustained, you can be Tulsa, and you know, the system of the United States will come in and demolish that. You know, and I just want to see if you know, you could share with us a little bit about that history. You know, where that started. You know, how that became policy and practice for the United States real estate market.
I think you bring up a real fascinating point, and again, if we look at sort of this arch and curated time and experience, it's not even just in the form of policy. It's also, you know, the cognitive and sociological programming of what enters into space of policy, how we view people. And like you mentioned Tulsa, for example, I think it's really almost, it's a jarring moment when you speak to people about the Red Summer riots of 1919, or you speak to people about places like Tulsa, and there's very little knowledge to understand that even in places where Black and brown bodies were creating insular economies, there was still this assault of this concept of wealth and not being able to own and have. And I really think it accentuates what is really at the root of a lot of this. And in the exhibition that we created in 2015, you know, we talk about redlining, yes, the policy that happens under the New Deal, but it's these metaphorical red lines as well that have been left indelible impressions in our culture of Americana, in our thinking of Americana. And when you go way back, even at the point of when we begin this progressive movement in the United States, when we see the rise of experts coming into this country, really stewarding the academic spaces of how we're going to present an ideology forth in academia, these experts then become who government agencies turn to, because there's sort of this case that's made, you don't know, we know, so listen to our school of thought. And I think when we look at the nugget of what gets informed there, you will see at that nucleus of the conversation around scientific racism and eugenics. And why that becomes so critical is because there's this hierarchy. And as we see, people like Madison Grant, who is one of the major influencers of the progressive era in conservationist movements, in looking at land use. He stewarded and oversaw the development of places like the Bronx Zoo. But what we don't know about someone who's a mentor to Teddy Roosevelt, what we don't know about is a book that he writes called The Passing of the Great Race, for example. In this book, there is this whole account of what is considered a human and what is considered a subspecies of a human. And with this type of ideology now going into our academia and in our school systems, you begin to influence a system that is inoculating an understanding of how we're going to reinforce this thought process within the built environment. And as a designer, when we look at affordable housing, or we look at current crises of unaffordability, we forget to understand that people who are making decisions at the table don't even know a history of how we have arrived to a place of tremendous inequity. So I think in order to frame a conversation of policies like redlining, we have to kind of look what preceded these spaces. And it was a dehumanization to be able to say, you don't matter. We see this dehumanization play out, obviously, with the native population that was here, but then as we begin to infiltrate and bring Black bodies from the African diaspora to property, to create the wealth, to work the lands for free, we begin to find the ways of people justifying that this behavior is what is the trajectory that's needed to maintain the purity of America. This wasn't something the founding fathers of this country that people, they didn't come up with this concept. They may have felt it. But the standardization and codification really came from what was considered the progressive movement of this country. And the people who were thinking progressively were the people that harbored these sentiments. So when you think of people like Homer Hoyt that come out of the University of Chicago, people, you say to someone, who's Homer Hoyt?
Exactly.
Homer Hoyt was the person that was the architect behind the blueprint of Federal Housing Administration policies to ensure that the concept of diversifying neighborhoods or racially integrated neighborhoods was bad for real estate. And takes this from the private industry and begins to infiltrate it into mainstream thinking. And what's the pivot here? These aren't just people now personally feeling something. These are people who are being put in positions of authority to steward federal policy and to think about what does it mean, and putting that thinking up against what does really democracy mean in America.
So a little more about Homer Hoyt and this what was the time frame of that? And I think, like you said, we got into this kind of federalized conversation. I think like when you're putting together the timeline and you talk about the basics, eugenics and like the understanding of humanity and like how humanity is defined in those times. Can you maybe help us a little bit, like go from that point to where it becomes, like a part of the private sector, and then eventually a part of the public sector, and and becomes like federal practice to, basically support these types of ideas, which they, it doesn't seem like there's a direct line, and I think that anytime you talk about those things, like, we end up with a lot of, kind of ambiguity around causality, and we're very quick to say that, the victims are in their positions because of a choice that they made or a choice that they didn't make. And it's like those narratives become trope, and then those trope become practices, and then we end up in this vicious cycle that this almost cannot be broken. And just like there's so much to peel back. I think that what your project does so well is to create an access point to layer after layer after layer after layer. When honestly we live in a country right now that is very much interested in being comfortably on the surface.
Yeah. Yes. Again, the significance of integrating individuals like Homer Hoy, they're operating in a power dynamic and a culture that it's not just now people like him rising. We have films like Birth of a Nation reinforcing this concept of the boogeyman, of the black boogeyman, praying towards white pureness. We see that yes, exactly, and we see that presidents that again are supposed to be stewarding democracy are hosting the viewing of Birth of a Nation at the White House. We see the spike that happens with that provocation within the built environment that then creates this massive enlistment into the Klan. And then we see we see Jim Crow, we see people fleeing Jim Crow, and the often missed story of people fleeing northern states from sundown laws, where if the sun goes down and you don't fit into the context of what they consider to be worthy or human, you're lynched. And this wasn't the South, this was Indiana, this was places in New York, it was many places that had sundown ordinances. So why it becomes significant is now, as this trajectory is happening and we fall through this Great Depression, when we think of home ownership in this country, for example, things like the New Deal created that possibility in this country. Before the New Deal, in order to buy a home, you had to put 30 to 50% down, and you had terms that were 5 to 7 years. And there was an analysis of risk, of course, assigned to who got these loans and were able to be homeowners. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is that the government steps in, and again, it's like the 2008 crises, where insurance companies and others were too big to fail. We create programs to really bail out the financial crises of the insurance companies and the banks in the New Deal. And in doing that, what we end up creating is a system and a standardization that when we first create the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is created to stop the hemorrhaging of the foreclosure crisis that is occurring in this country. So now we go out and we say to the homeowner, hey, you don't have to worry about the 5 to 7 year loan. We're going to convert that to what we're all more familiar with, the 15 to 30 year mortgage, right? But we're not only going to atomize risk of condition of housing stock, transportation, what type of industries, we're going to judge the character of the borrower. And this is an example right here on the screen. When you look at the question of detrimental influence, this is an area description that complements these redlining maps that are created in 239 cities across America under the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And again, these were things that were used, or tactics that were used, tools by private industry. And people that, like Homer Hoyt, who were promoting these tools, are now bringing it into the federal government. He's writing the manual, basically, for the federal government. So if you see a question that says detrimental influence, and you see after that question it says Negro infiltration, how are you not reinforcing through the verbiage that having anything other in an area is not going to be in your best interest? So now you're creating this understanding that Negro presence at this time is something that we're not allowed to have in the community. And we also have to remember at the time when these policies were created, people who think that they're part of what is identified as a white privileged class are not considered white. Italian, Jewish, Irish, all these ethnicities graduate into whiteness after World War II. So you can see here infiltration of, in question E, Italian and Negro. So now we begin to create this presence of who has access to now federal policy that's supposed to be in public domain. We see how the private cognitive thinking has found its way into a power dynamic that has been reinforced by policy. Now, after FHA, after the Home Zone Corporation creates redlining maps, we see that the Federal Housing Administration adopts these methodologies. And they take it a step further. 239 cities have maps, right? Mm-hmm. Now, Federal Housing Administration, the sister agency, which is what is still here with us today, creates what is known as Federal Underwriting Manuals. Mm-hmm. And when you read sort of the stipulations, and Ta-Nehisi Coates makes mention of this in the case for reparations, in his article, we see Kenneth Jackson in the Crabgrass Frontier, who actually was the person who uncovered this information at the National Archives, basically looking at sort of the role that we have played to systematize the geographical footprint of America. So if you read this, I don't know if you want to read it, but this is really a smoking gun to what has happened in segregating the communities of America that have led to the hyper-segregation. I mean, when you say if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability. You're setting the tone now, not just for the federal government, but the banks, the real estate industry, the insurance industry, and now everyone's beginning to eat from this, right? Because it's not just these industries. As we create massive suburbanization in America, we employ tactics like restricted deeds and covenants that have stipulation in the homes that you cannot buy or be in these homes if you're not white, essentially. So we're carving out opportunity in America, which then really sort of bastardizes this definition of wealth and access, because it was never at a grounding of equality. So, I mean, vote for segregation, look at your home, places like Levittown, Pennsylvania. I mean, the fact that you would burn or torment and terrorize a family, which is what was done in many of the suburbs when the first black family moves in, it really begins to uncover sort of the conditioning and what is happening to this day in this country.
So yeah, I think what you mentioned, it sounds like, I'm about to probably get into that a little bit more and put those narratives, like the experience for the actual homeowner to have, a condition, like needle infestation.
Yes.
Can you share like what that experience would be like, white suburban family, living wherever, and all of a sudden there's an inspection or gradation or some kind of qualification that then brings about this status? Like, what would the impact of that be for the homeowner?
It's really interesting. There's many communities throughout the country that were actually stable communities. So as we're passing this legislation and seeing it roll out into real time in neighborhoods, these are actually beautiful, walkable neighborhoods. Not as diverse as we expect them to be, but there is some diversity. What happens now is that you have real estate agents that are speculating on communities and areas. And what they're doing is create this blockbuster. And they're saying to families, hey, did you see this black family just moved down the street? If you don't sell to me, you're gonna lose value on your property, and I'll just come back next week, and I'm just giving a number. Let's say I can buy it for $500 this week, I'll let that seep in, and I'll just buy it for $250 down the line, right? So it's creating this financial panic of there goes the neighborhood as a result of this presence. So what you see ultimately is the rise of white flight in this country, particularly from the urban centers. And that speculator that's prompting this fear is also then turning around and taking that same house that he just bought for $500 and preying upon people that are looking for better housing, that are coming from deplorable housing conditions, and moving into neighborhoods with no understanding that this area has been considered a red line and is destined for decline. So instead of selling it for $1,000, now they're selling it on contract, not even through a mortgage, because we know Black and brown families can't access mortgages. And if they do access them, they're accessing them in areas that they know can never appreciate in value. So it's creating financial ruin and devastation for many of the families that are working and believing that opportunity does exist for them as well. So you could imagine with the advent of white flight leaving and now using highway systems to go into suburbs, what begins to happen to places like my hometown, the Bronx, and beyond, that begin to suffer from severe disinvestment because tax bases are low. And deindustrialization is happening simultaneously, so people don't have access to jobs, or jobs are leaving to the suburbs. So you're creating a condition that makes it almost inhumane and devoid of any ability for actually seeing a human being be able to survive under those conditions.
So I think this slide that we're going to be talking about, like how that has become an essential tool for politicians. And, you know, and I know that when we think about these things, like, you know, you like to think that this is historical, but like right now, we're hearing, like, you know, the president just recently made a ploy to suburban women and made an attack against the opponent about a plan to bring in, you know, the derelict and all of these other tropes and mythologies, the boogeyman, and come to your neighborhood if you don't vote for me. And, you know, I think as shocking as that was for people, they realize that it's just part and parcel. It's always been a part of the, you know, political process when it comes to election. And I would love to hear more about some of the tropes like the welfare queen and, you know, some of these other things that we've heard and, you know, actually to some degree believe. And then, you know, and then to most degrees actually hold people accountable for the situations they're in ways that they just don't have the power and influence be, and like just knowing that people are there very intentionally. That it is a part of a plan and a policy to keep people in those spaces.
I mean, again, you're in this kind of space of, it's almost incredulous, but it isn't, right? It's Woodrow Wilson's mentality of Birth of a Nation playing out all over again, using the podium of the presidency to deploy these fear tactics to politicize the conditions of this country. I think is really, you're almost taken aback because there is this narrative. There is this understanding of, unfortunately, that we have not been exposed enough in our education system, in our very communities and neighborhoods, schools around us. We're not, the dominant narrative that gets invoked when people are seeking power, whether it's the trope of the suburban experience or whether it's bringing them to heel, as we've heard in past conversations. There's this programming of what has happened and what continues to happen. And it's just, it's another page to turn of a playbook that has long been part of the political agenda, to put fear into people, to dehumanize, to have no empathy for others. And what we saw that play out very well is even after the heels of the uprisings of the 60s. I mean, here we are, 50 plus years later in Washington, D.C., demanding the same human needs. What does that speak to? That's not just a Trump thing. That's something is not right in the system and the structure. And what is even more devastating is that, yes, we see the play out of what happened with the uprisings. On the heels of the uprisings, we had the heroin epidemic in our communities. On the heels of the heroin epidemic in our communities, we had the HIV/AIDS epidemic in our communities. On the heels of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we had the crack epidemic. On the heels of the crack epidemic, we've had enormous violence. And we have somehow blamed the people in our communities as to scapegoat the responsibility of the failure of those, again, put in positions of power to steward what is the ideologies and principles of we the people. And if we don't begin to harness that power back, people can be tired just like they were in 1963. But that, we can't have moments. We have to have movements.
Exactly.
And it becomes critical to invest in the strategies that counter these narratives. I think it's almost distasteful because you can look at what Lee Atwater said, and it isn't just the party affiliation. This is about an individual who has this belief that it is okay to be inhumane and dehumanized, and bring that into the highest office that is supposed to dictate what we believe in. When we have our children pledge allegiance in schools to a flag, when we have people stand for the Star-Spangled Banner and not take this into account and understand why people kneel, then you're not a steward for democracy. You cannot hold in the same breath that you believe in America and yet not hold these systems accountable. So it becomes imperative that we have this curated understanding of what has happened and why we have gotten to a point where you have someone on national TV trying to protect the fallacy of suburbia and America. And it's much deeper.
And whiteness.
And it's much deeper. It is, again, to look at a human being and say, you're not deserving. Who do you think you are to feel that? What has happened that you have even allowed that to fall through the cracks in this country? Our education system doesn't talk about this history. I don't ever remember hearing about Lee Atwater's statement, basically dog whistling tax cuts, and what he speaks of here as a tactic to hurt who? As he says it, blacks get hurt worse than whites. Where is this coming from?
And I think that's just like such a critical and important part of your project. It's like, because if we learn of the Lee Atwaters, and we learn about, the practices that have been put in place, and we learn about the people who've been a part of the historic power structure, and how they regularly embrace this concept of dehumanizing people based on the color of their skin, sexual orientation, all of these other elements that they put in. I think what it then does is it teaches us how to detect the wolves. It gives us a way to look at people and realize that what we're dealing with. And it's in a time of tremendous gaslighting. It's kind of hard to figure out who to trust and what to trust. And like you said earlier, it's not about Trump. That's one of the biggest things that I feel like we're going to be challenged with. I think the minute that Trump is gone, then it's all over.
Right.
It's not. We still have an incredibly racist education system, school systems. The way that schools are funded is directly connected to exactly what you're talking about. So the neighborhoods that are the poorest are the ones that have the least amount of resources. Richer schools actually get the tax base that they need to get the books that they need, to repair the facilities that they need. And I just think that so much of the conversation, the work that you're doing is a part of every single conversation that we have about race, because we can't escape capitalism, can't escape the concept of wealth in the United States, and those things are just inextricable. You can't, because it was built that way. And I think that so much more of our existence in this country is impacted by that in ways that we don't we may not even realize, and it's become, so conditioned that it's almost at the point that we don't rise up over things that just makes absolutely no sense. That is, the condition of like how people are treated, and we won't accept that because we bought into the trope that people are where they are because of them and not because of that system.
And I don't know if you find it as surprising as I find it, because sometimes, even within our own spaces, that we play optics, right? We play this game of optics, that people that look like you and I have our best interest at heart and will then understand what has systemically happened.
Yeah.
But because in whatever way they made it, if they made it, there must be something wrong with
the rest
you.
of us. Yeah.
And that's something, this internalized racial conflict also has to be part of this conversation. Because it's not, again, what the usual suspects are. It's even how we have accepted it in our perceptions and have reinforced it on how we even treat each other. And I think it is so critical to speak about, because when you look at the major areas that are suffering from gentrification, who's the leadership in these cities? And if you pause and reflect a little bit, right? How is that happening, and why is that happening? People who are on the front lines have seen the conditions of neighborhoods like the Bronx. And the Bronx, I mean, being from the Bronx and seeing the burning, the total devaluing of space, and then the ability now, when you depreciated something so low, to now send in speculators. And now you've created such expensive real estate in places like the Bronx and Washington, D.C. That the people who were here and no one else wanted to be here can no longer afford to stay in their place. And where are they going to be sent to? The new redlined communities. So it's a bigger system that we have to begin to uncover, to peel back, to make part of the pedagogy of how we understand spatial dynamics. But then it's really holding accountable and questioning ourselves. What is our value system? What are we interested in doing? Is it that I'm a minority woman business-owned enterprise? That's the threshold? Or is it that I'm really conscientious about how I employ being an architect and a designer and my profession into the built environment?
So, did you work all the way through this?
I think we could want to see some other. Are you having fun, Keith?
Yeah, I'm tall.
Yeah, this is. We don't have to go through this.
Because I think we were in the conversation, it was really strong. I would just say if there's a speculation that you have, maybe we can share a little bit about like what is happening with gentrification, what is happening in these urban centers, and because there is some belief, at least Tucker Carlson told Mary Bowser that everyone's leaving your city. Which I don't see, but I think that there's some interest and some intrigue, because you're thinking about like the systems of power and thinking about media. There's something very intentional about like why he said that. Either that's the case or either that's the narrative that they want to posit for some other gain. So, and I think with what's happening in definitely east of the river in Washington, D.C., because I think, northwest Washington, D.C., that ship is long since sailed. It is gentrified, but as you get deeper towards 7 and 8, which I feel is like the equivalent to the Bronx, to like the New York metropolitan area. What kind of conversation, what kind of education, like even the term like affordable housing, and and like your use of language.
Right.
You know, like in Washington DC, as a single person, you can make up to $92,000 a year and be able to access affordable housing. And that is not the affordable housing conversation that we have. That is not the affordable housing conversation that's going to bring about any kind of resolution to the housing crisis. But like, how do we talk about accessible housing in a time like this, in a market like this? You know, and, you know, accessible housing and a market that's just known to be one of the hottest markets in the world, and everybody's just interested in being in it. And how do we actually create some kind of action around our leaders and our officials to hold them accountable and protect, you know, the least resources of our residents?
I think that when we look at, again, conditions that hold systems in place, a big aspect of one of them is the mental health, right? And if we don't begin to shift the understanding of what has happened, and we can't just solely rely on an academic space to do that. We have to do that. We have to say, you know, actually you did pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, you worked hard, but you did have a whole bunch of help in the form of subsidies, right? Because it's like you said, when we speak of the vernacular we use to identify things like affordable housing, it's very stigmatizing. Because in some way it's almost portraying, you know, a sense of you have to earn a space, right? It's affordable for you because you can't live in this space.
You really can't be here.
Right.
However,
and it perpetuates a thinking that in all bases, not just what we traditionally think, that what we give is enough, or it has to be the threshold. And I think this is what Designing the Lead is very passionate about, is really creating this alternative narrative to reframe this dominant perception that has really prevailed in our society. And through that reframing, redesign the possibilities. And redesigning isn't just an actual structure. Redesigning is even changing how we use vernacular. One word that really always gets under my skin when I speak to people, when it involves anything around affordability, is low income. It drives me insane. And people are, well, what else are we supposed to do? Are you telling me that we built the entire American middle class under New Deal policy? Nothing in that language, in the flyers, anything that was promoted to allow you to become a homeowner. Nothing ever said, we're targeting you, low-income community. Look at what you can get. I never said any of that. But yet, when we talk about populations, when you say low income, it's a dog whistle for a certain vision to come in your head.
It's an assignment.
And meanwhile, we know that affordability is a crisis amongst all of us. So why is it that we can't redesign how we talk about these things? And in the redesigning, we allow for investments. And another component of investments with opportunity zones and all of these creative tools we're using, who's investing in these spaces? And we have to start looking at the lens of foreign investments coming in to this country. That's a huge issue. Because now you're creating these real estate investment trusts that people are putting money into. And under that fund, people are going out and buying up land. And the person on the other end that's receiving the return on that investment has no connectivity to the neighborhoods that they're buying and gobbling up. That's very problematic. So forget about what's happening here. But when you have now influences that you can't even see that individual, it creates a complete disconnect. So in doing this work, you know, creating processes that allow, it's not like a community binding agreement. It's really, how do you start within government agencies, within the different spaces, really activating? How do we create a participatory design process that is a master planning that makes us all, again, designers, and looks at what creates vibrancy from an ecosystem standpoint. How are communities healthy? And how do we do it in a way that at the center of this planning is focused on equity and inclusion? So as we begin to pivot and frame and think about how do we move forward, whoever is in office come November, we have to find mechanisms to also activate. And the more informed we are, the more we redesign and create visions, the more we can hold accountable a center of shared value and understanding.
One point there that you mentioned that I think is a part of the conversation in the upcoming election is opportunity zones. And I think, you know, like the Clean Air Act from the Bush administration, you know, it's like anything but. And, you know, when you hear that terminology and it's used, I'm sure you heard it in the campaign a lot. I think it would be helpful for people to understand exactly what those conditions are and, you know, what the relationship and the success rate of creating Black wealth. Because that's supposed to be the understanding and the framework is it's creating Black wealth. But the reality is the opportunity zones have not provided opportunity for new wealth, new growth. The threshold for entry is so high. You know, it's almost impossible and it's ineffective product, but we hear about it all the time. And I think when we hear things like welfare queen and opportunity zones, when we hear those things thrown at us, if we don't have anything to grasp onto, like we somehow get hit with those things and we actually think that, you know, what's being said is true. Can you share a little about, like, you know, your experience and understanding about these opportunity zones and how they work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think whether they're called opportunity zones, empowerment zones, I mean, there's a history of how we create tax benefits and subsidies to attract investments into neighborhoods, right? We see what happened in Harlem with the tax deferments that occurred. You build here, you'll have a tax abatement 15 to 30 years. Well, that tax abatement, you're not paying taxes then. So when you're not paying taxes, all the amenities of the school systems and everything like that are not being resuscitated, but you're still getting the advantageous point of building your own wealth. Yeah. So opportunity zones, it may be the calling to attract private investment into historically disenfranchised or sidelined communities, but the mechanism of how that happens is the wild, wild west. I mean, a person can says, you know, I have the intention of wanting to do X, and they'll say, look, I'm beautifying your neighborhood. Isn't it better than what it was? But does that actually trickle down into the quality of life changing for those very people that you were promulgating from the beginning, the creation of such policy? It goes back to, Sheldon, that we don't have the systems in place, and there may very well be well-intentioned investors, but the framework to create the pipelining of that investment to actually inform innovative opportunities like community land trusts, or, as you said before, accessible housing, cooperatives, all these things that really activate full participation in health and wellness and economy, they don't exist. We think that by default, the leprechaun is going to prance around and sprinkle his dust, and everyone's going to have the luck of the Irish and find gold at the end of the rainbow. Yeah. But that's not what has ever happened. And we miss these opportunities. So it becomes a very dangerous space, because many times the people who are creating these policies are so disconnected from the ramifications and the collateral consequences. So how do we begin to say, listen, if you have this and make it digestible, distill this information? Again, learning spaces. Where are people learning about opportunity zones? Where? They are in the high-level boardrooms of the Goldman Sachs or wherever these investment firms are. But I haven't been to a community meeting that really distills it, that if it doesn't go your way, what it means in speculation for these communities. So, you know, as great as it all may seem, what are the processes? What are the design processes that are really anchored in equity and inclusion? And we need more of that.
Yeah, I think that you framed it very nicely, because that's where we're learning about this. And, you know, and you are obviously a part of that answer, like with your work. And, you know, this is why it's so important to continue to expand what you're doing, because people need to hear that. And they need to learn, and they need to understand at the end of the day, this is what's going to happen to my neighborhood under these conditions.
It's the pedagogy, it's the understanding, and it's the willingness of philanthropic organizations, of those who can put the initial risk in, to say this is worth pivoting from. This is worth understanding that if we don't think of systems differently, we become complicit in exacerbating the inequity. So how do we begin to listen to the people that are on the ground doing this work and really support what the shared value of that conversation is versus the patriarchal approach of I know better and what's best for you. So we have a lot of work to be done, but I think there is hope to create this more just and inclusive capital W, capital E, because our democracy depends on it. Without it, we're not going to be the stewards that carry on this belief of the pursuit of happiness of we the people to the next generation. And our framework is really beautiful. It's just unfortunately those who have been stewarding the framework are a little ugly in the equation. But we have a moment now to create a movement from and really think differently and put the tools on the table to say, let's roll up our sleeves and how do we do this together?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the exhibition is here at Eaton and open to the public, absolutely free. It opens on August 28th, and it'll be here through December 31st. We may get extended beyond that. And you know, as safely as we can, we'll continue to support support conversations around some of this very deep and important work that April and her team has been doing. The exhibition is interactive, so you know, come prepared to take a part and contribute. That is a part of the capital W, capital E that this program is designed to impact. And yeah, we'll just continue to keep the conversations going, because we haven't gotten into like sports arenas and all these other things that are big conversations about, you know, our neighborhoods and our communities, our cities, and our lives. So thank you again, April, and look forward to seeing you here at Eaton, DC.